Welcome back to the discussion that we're having on what racism, systemic racism is and is not. We are here with Crystal Kohenke, Dr. Ekpe, and Dr. Alston. And the next question is going to go for you, Crystal. And then please, everyone, bring in your perspectives as well. How does systemic racism affect our communities?
Well, and like I mentioned previously, for me and my experiences where I have a particular passion is around education. And I'm fortunate enough to work with some organizations here in San Antonio that are focused on workforce development. And they target wonderful people that for whatever reason didn't have access to education or access to continuing education to get those living wage jobs. And what's powerful about finding those barriers and for these people, for example, in this one particular organization I'm working with, it's simple things. It's like it's childcare. You would think it's simple. It's childcare to be able to go to school. It's having bus ride, the bus fare to be able to get transportation. And so those are some of the basic things that keep people from being able to expand and grow and have access to the education that leads to the better jobs. And then it's systemic in that it perpetuates from parent to child. And so there's got to be ways that we break that system to be able to allow people to expand and to grow, because once you do that, it's generational. It passes forward. It moves. It's paying it forward. And so I think there's a lot of different ways. Again, like we said, it's very complex, but for me, that's one of the areas that I have particular passion about, that I've seen remarkable progress if you help people remove barriers. And so people want that opportunity. And so how do you help identify and then remove those barriers that they can't do for themselves?
That's great. Love the idea of ripple effect. You draw a drop in the river, and then how the waves go, and it can that one drop can affect so many generations to come and change the trajectory of a person's, not only themselves but their families and so on. So thank you. Any other thoughts on how systemic racism affects our community?
Well, I want to chime in because Crystal gave some really great things, but I want to say that systemic racism creates disparities in all indicators of success in the for American life. You think about wealth creation. You think about how we're treated. People of color are treated in the criminal justice system. I mean, just think about this. People of color make up about 13–14% of the population in the United States. In the land of free, we have 25% of all the incarcerated population in our jails. And of that 25%, upwards of almost 40% are people of color. And that's systemic racism having a huge impact on people and families and abilities. There are entire generations of Americans today that have grown up without their fathers because their fathers and their brothers were in prison. So you talk about the impact on employment and the impact on housing, healthcare, politics, and definitely in education. So every indicator of success in this country is impacted by systemic racism.
And to piggyback onto what you said, if you want an example where systemic racism affects our community, I obviously always look at it from a healthcare slant. We all know about the opioid epidemic and the opioid crisis, and it's affected quite a few individuals in rural communities, but mainly Caucasian males. And thankfully, we have received quite a boost from our federal government, over $4 billion towards the opiate crisis. Well, you have to say, 20 years ago, there was a huge crack cocaine crisis in the African American community, but instead we were painted as burglars, thieves, and criminals. And when you talk about 30% of African American males being incarcerated, they were incarcerated for being addicted to substances. So when you talk about systemic racism, you have to look at it. when African Americans were in crisis with the crack cocaine epidemic, there wasn't necessarily a federally funded program to help individuals get back into society and become contributing members of society. But now there is for the opiate crisis, and you have to ask yourself the question, well, why? It's because it's affecting what is considered to be the superior or more important or closer to home for those people making these policy decisions. It's affecting those individuals. So that's an example to me of what I see in the healthcare industry of systemic racism and how it affects our community. From a doctor standpoint too, we know in medical schools, if our medical students go to a medical school where there's no promotion of diversity, if there is a lot of medical hierarchy or an authoritarianism where people who are not of color are considered the best, those individuals will go on to want to be in communities or to practice medicine in communities where there's only one sort of people. They will not want to help the minority populations or the underserved. But if we can teach them in medical school by programs, by minority health reform, by learning about inclusion and diversity and health equities, those individuals do want to go on to practice in underserved communities and with minority populations. So that's another form of systemic racism that we see, and it leads to the physician shortage, which is why we have certain zip codes where they're overly saturated with physicians, and we have other zip codes that don't have enough physicians to actually serve that population.
That's great. Thank you. This is very helpful. I just had a meeting with two physicians that are also working with you in the training of physicians and the residency programs that we have. And that's exactly what they requested. Said, Marcos, can your team come up with trainings on exactly that? Help is that bring the issues to the surface. And now I'm going to add the inspiration to go and work in marginalized communities.
Yes.
Add that curriculum too. So thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts on this. I have another question, and that Dr. Egbe, if I can rely on you for this. Does systemic racism affect the way we care for our consumers of healthcare or for our patients?
Yes, it does. I mean, it goes back to history. You look at the Tuskegee experiments. I went to the University of Alabama in Birmingham and enrolled, but we did learn quite a bit about the Tuskegee experiment. Again, a federally funded program where they deliberately misinformed African-American men and told them that they were giving them free health care for the treatment of their syphilis, when in fact they were just observing the natural course of their disease. And that, even after the discovery of penicillin, that study went on until 1972. And you look at Henrietta Lacks, that's the lady that all of the cells have come from. Even when I was in college, I was doing experiments with the HeLa cells, and I didn't know they came from her, but they had never asked her consent to take those cells from her. They never informed her family and if they interviewed the physicians, and this is from Johns Hopkins University, which was considered our model medical school, it still is. They just didn't think they were educated people. That was something they could understand. They just didn't feel they had enough dignity because of their race to even be considered in that decision. So what do you end up with? You end up with a generation of people of color with a mistrust of the medical system. Johns Hopkins is a premier system, but people in Baltimore still won't go there because they remember what happened to grandmom or remember what happened to mom. You get fast forward till now. Just in 2016, they did a study of medical students to ask them, and 40% think that African-American people have thicker skin than Caucasian people. These are people that are out practicing medicine now. They also think that African-American people are basically less sensitive to pain. We can basically handle pain a lot stronger pain than Caucasians. And these are people who are training to be your physician. And so then you wonder, why is the African-American maternal fetal mortality so high? That's something we're all trying to fight. African-American women only give birth to 11%, but they're 30% of the mortality after childbirth. So you have people who were historically disenfranchised, don't have a lot of trust in the medical community, but then when they come to the medical community, because of the way they look and because of systemic racism, they don't get the best care that they could get. So yes, it does. And it is corrected even for socioeconomics. Your health insurance, Kaiser Permanente has shown us that. Beyonce and Serena Williams, one's a billionaire and the other is a multimillionaire, very educated women, both of whom almost died in childbirth. And Serena Williams, she was screaming and saying she was short of breath, and the physicians were like, well, let's do this test. And she finally said, listen to Dr. Williams, and they did a lung scan and found out she had a big blood clot after she gave birth to her daughter. And could have died. So those are things that you really need to understand. So it definitely affects healthcare. I agree with what Crystal said about implicit biases too. You really have to know your implicit biases as well, because you may not think that you're overtly racist, but you may have a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions you're not even aware of, and it will affect the treatment of your patients, and it will affect their mortality.
Thank you. This is great information. Any more comments on that?
Yeah, it's just kind of piggyback. It's really about a legacy of trauma.
Yes.
Right. It's really about a legacy of trauma. And, you know, if you believe that a person has, you know, thicker skin or endured more pain, you're not going to get the type of attention you need to be cured. So our communities have always been left to, communities of color have always been left to talking about trying to find out those doctors and hospitals that are sympathetic to us, and coming up with remedies and solutions internally, and that they continue to suffer for chronic illnesses like obesity and diabetes and heart disease, simply because we're not getting the care early on to prevent all these things because of a legacy of trauma. We just don't want to have to endure. You know, so a couple of years ago, my wife, we live in a pretty much affluent white neighborhood, went to see a foot doctor who was recommended by our primary care physician. And she goes into the waiting room, signs in, sits down, and the lady the receptionist keeps looking at her like, well, you need to pay for this visit now because we know you people don't pay. Wait, hold on, what are you talking about? You people, what do you mean? Whatever your visit is, I'm gonna pay, but we need you to pay up front. Well, is that what you ask all your people to do? No, but we just know you people are going to run out without paying. So, of course, she did not get the service. We contacted our primary care physician and said, "You either get him out of your referral network, or we will guarantee you that you will not be in our referral network." And
Wow.
and so imagine that. So just imagine this is a doctor, a predominant foot doctor in North Texas, who was pretty much making it set up so that African Americans cannot come to his practice by paying up front. And I think there was like $250 office visit plus labs and all this other stuff up front. So that's what systematic racism is: placing barriers in front of people that are not necessary, that prevent positive effects. So there you go.
That is great. You know, one thing, all the more the case for cultural competent care training and education, because only 5% of our physicians in the nation are African American, to a population of 14% African American. So we cultural competence, until we can increase that ratio of physicians of color in the workplace, we need to rely on that heavily, because these are great examples of what you guys just shared. Thank you. Okay, I have one last question. I could stay in this one for a long time, but I think let's move on. As a healthcare system, what are we doing? So it's a two-part question. As a healthcare system, what are we doing but also as individuals, what can we do to address systemic racism? So as a system, what are we doing? But also as individuals, what can we do to address systemic racism? And all, Crystal, you want to take that one first?
I'll go. Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to say, wow, powerful messages from both of you. So thank you for being so open and sharing. As a healthcare system, I think we're doing a lot, having this conversation, right? Having the dialogue, sharing our stories, sharing our personal experiences. I think that's one way of helping people to understand and to hear that there are differences. And I think we're doing a lot of really good work around that. And then as individuals, you hear a lot about the statements, if you don't take a stand, that's also taking a stand, right? And as individuals, we need to ask the question, we need to have the conversation. And as Dr. Egby said, as we talked about earlier, we all have biases. And until you start to question them and ask yourself, what are my biases? You don't become open to the conversation or open to the realization that there are differences. So I think we're doing a lot around, from a healthcare system, having the conversation, finding mechanisms, finding opportunities to talk about it. But then as individuals, we need to own that space too. We need to step in.
Any other comments from?
Yeah, absolutely. So, man, I love working for Christus Health. The whole idea of extending the healing mission of Jesus Christ for everybody.
Yes.
I think we could probably, I think we do a great job of extending that message, but I think that message needs to be loud and clear in all communities, especially of communities of color, because we want to invite everybody in. I think we do a really great job of that. So, I think we, as an individual, we just have to acknowledge that racism exists. It does exist. It's real. And it has caused real damage to people individually and collectively in this country. So, and we got to get involved with those organizations that are fighting against it actively. I think as a system, we could probably support some groups that are working in different areas to enlighten people and help people and kind of rebalance the scales and things like, the homelessness and, psych patients and other things like that. And I think another thing is, we have to, as individuals, we have to get out there and vote. Man, we have to vote for leaders who are going to make policy decisions that help all of us, not just help a narrow band of constituents. Because it's really about a race for resources, right? In the American dream is really about who has all the resources. But we're fortunate enough to live in a country that there's plenty for everybody if we just get the people in place who can lead and make the decisions that benefit us all.
Agree. I would just say from a system standpoint, I agree with what both of you have said, but I believe one of the most wonderful things that I saw about Christus after the recent incidents with George Floyd is that calling out racism and inappropriate behavior for what it is was started by the top down. So Ernie Sandow immediately sent out a letter saying that the Christus system would not stand for this. And you need a strong stance, but you need a strong stand from your leadership, because it's very difficult sometimes to really start to have those conversations with other departments when you don't have the support of your leadership or the acknowledgement from your leadership that systemic racism is occurring. And then as individuals, we have to have those conversations and call it out. We have to be advocates, and we have to have what I tell some of my Caucasian friends, you and I are going to have the uncomfortable conversation, but a place, in a safe space where we can both express ourselves, because I don't want you to see things like the George Floyd tragedy as something that's new and that's never happened before. It's something that's been happening, but now we have iPhones and we have videos and we can show it to the rest of the world. I want you to already know that that's existing. It's not a new problem. It's a problem that we've all deliberately not wanted to talk about and really not wanted to address until the top blew off. So those are two things that I would add. I think this, Marcos, what you're doing is just from a leadership standpoint and a system standpoint, is such a step in the right direction, because we're finally having those conversations and broadcasting to people who want to hear and they want to feel validated.
Thank you. Thank you. And, having people like you guys that are willing to also talk, because this is not just talking, this is pouring your heart out, and I'm really appreciative. One of the things that from our end, from where I sit, I look at our community benefit investments as an organization in marginalized communities, our equity of care program, as we help individuals with safety nets that really, they don't have this extra support, they're going to end up back in our emergency rooms with conditions that are frankly unnecessary. What I see are insurance coverage campaigns that CHRISTUS have gone out there and help people to join a health insurance if they're eligible. The HR programs around training individuals in zip codes that are low-income zip codes so they can earn livable wages, and what an impact that has. And absolutely, they get out and vote. That's a big one. Regardless of the political party, get to know your candidates and understand what do they stand for. It doesn't matter one side or the other. I'm saying get to know them, understand what they stand in, and vote. So thank you for giving of your time. Thank you for your knowledge, and more importantly, thank you for your hearts, because this is hard work. For our One CHRISTUS family, stay tuned for our next learning opportunity in a few weeks. Please email any questions or concerns that you will have, as we will continue to address these issues as together we grow in our knowledge, we grow in our understanding, more importantly, we grow in our humanity. So again, thank you for joining, and I'll see you next time.